been co-leading LEAP. It's my enormous pleasure to welcome as our final speaker, Dustin Benton. Dustin grew up in California, but came to the UK to do his undergraduate work at St. Andrews on international relations and French. And stayed in the UK, worked for a bit for the campaign for the protection of rural England, and then joined, 15 years ago now, the Green Alliance? 12 years ago. And the Green Alliance, many of you will know what the Green Alliance is. It's probably the UK's premier environmental think tank, does really influential work on the environment, and sort of approaches the issues from a non-ideological perspective. And within working with the Green Alliance, Dustin initially worked largely on energy, on the circular economy, and on power systems, and also was involved in the big initiative working in Brussels and setting up an office in Europe that was slightly stymied by post-Brexit things. But for the last 6-7 years has been particularly interested in land use and food. And Dustin played a very major part in the National Food Strategy that was led by Henry Dimbleby. And to my mind, is one of the most influential and original thinkers around the whole issue of land use in the UK today. So with no further ado, Dustin.
Well, thank you very much. And with that introduction, I feel I can only disappoint. So apologies in advance. This is a talk which has elements of stuff I presented before and elements of novelty. And I thought I would bring the novelty bit to this crowd because you're a bunch of deep thinkers who know tons about the food system, almost certainly more than me. And I'm keen to get your criticism if I put my foot wrong. But the challenge I've set for myself is to talk a little bit about the politics of diet change. And I have to say, of all the political problems I've dealt with in the kind of broad environment sector, diet change is like the hardest. I remember I had a brilliant conversation with Meg Hillier, actually, I can name her, who said, basically, as politicians, we don't want to go anywhere near near your house. Like, we don't want to be in the bedroom, we don't want to be in the kitchen. That's just not a place for politics. Please, for the love of God, keep us out of there. It was actually a conversation about energy systems a while ago, but I think it's every bit as true for food. But because I did a lot of the analysis for the National Food Strategy, I also know that it's essentially impossible for me to envisage a way of squaring the circle of all the things that we want from our land system, how we restore the natural environment, without diet change. So I've got this problem, right? Diet change is both impossible and essential. But I'm an environmentalist, right? And so I don't want to believe that. That's what the evidence is telling me, but I don't like it. So I'm going to try to think my way through. And I'm going to tell you a bit of a story about my background from last decade, where I was mostly focused on energy systems, where I think it's fair to say that we have moved from a transition where everything seemed impossible. I mean, 15 years ago, the energy system was, irrevocably coal-fired and fossil fuel heavy. And now it feels like it's inevitable that we're going to have clean power and electric vehicles, and everything's going to be zero carbon, and that will lower sort of broader environmental impact as well. So I don't think the clean energy transition is totally analogous to the food system transmission that we kind of need to go through, but there are family resemblances. So I will try to talk through a bit of my experience of the energy system transition, and then reflect on where I think there are some analogies and what we might learn. Then I'll give you a little preview of some work that I have done with my colleague Lydia Collis, which seeks to use this with a bit of quantitative modeling work, which I hope will be interesting. So that's it. I've probably got way too much content, and in that spirit, I'm going to go start with the problem, but you guys know this, so I'm going to go really, really fast. Do shout at me if it's too fast, but I feel like let's not dwell too much. So I guess the starting point is we are asking so much from our land system, and I'm going to swap between land and diet. I'm going to try to talk mostly about diet, and I should say I'm ignoring health here because otherwise we'll be here for 3 or 4 hours. we've always wanted the kind of good food, cultural value, viable rural economies, but we've added this list of other things that we as society are asking from the land system: habitats, carbon removal, maybe self-sufficiency, quite a contested term. It's a relatively new thing. I'm just going to focus on the new goals a bit as we think about where we're starting from. And I think we need to acknowledge that the natural world is not in a great place. Again, I'm not going to go on too long, but it is depressing to me as an environmentalist who mostly did climate, how absolutely crap our outcomes are, and also how diminished our goals are. So we did a bit of quantification of the government's turn around the decline of nature and increase it by 10% by 2042. And that would mean restoring 1% of the moth species, 3% of the butterflies, and 5% of the bird abundance that we have lost in the UK since 1970. That doesn't sound like restoration to me. That sounds pretty mediocre. The government will not frame the numbers in those terms, but that's even what our ambition is. So we're not starting from a great place. We kind of know why. So this is work I did for the food strategy. You'll see on your right-hand side prehistory back, and this is the mass of all species by weight. Lovely piece of analysis. This is actually a bit out of date. I'll explain why. But essentially what we've done is we've kind of turned the natural world into farm animals. We've also massively increased the productivity of the natural world by dumping lots of nitrogen fertilizer and changing land use and selective breeding and loads of other very, very clever things. What we've ended up with is, by mass, we and the animals that we eat absolutely dominate the land system. And so you kind of can't reckon with the loss of nature without thinking about what we eat and how we have repurposed the world. We actually have created superabundance. I think that we harvest 6,000 kilocalories per person per day globally in the food system, and we also get 4,000 kilocalories per person per day's worth of grass that we feed into ruminants. This is an incredible source of abundance. It's kind of mad, and also, I don't know whether any of you saw the chicken talk before about how we've got these amazing chickens. If you just sort of switch off some bits of your brain and you look at the 960-gram chicken versus the 4-kilo chicken, you just think, that's extraordinary. But that's what we've done to the whole land system and the whole world. You can express this in land area. So these hexagons are representative of the land area that we use in the UK to feed ourselves. You'll note that quite a lot of that land is in these lovely little hexagons overseas. Ignore where that is, but that's because we are dependent on the rest of the world. And in the spirit of going quickly, I will just point out the 2/3 of the food that is plants, or rather 2/3 of the calories that we eat that are plants, take up that little bit of land versus all of that land that provides the rest of what we eat, which is mostly meat and dairy. You can't ignore when you start to quantify things the heavy burden of the level of meat and dairy that we consume in the UK in what it forces us to do with our land system. Briefly on carbon, the story is not really any more optimistic. So you see at the top bar there, decarbonisation across the whole economy in grey. We've done quite a good job in the UK for a rich country. We're decarbonising, but the food system itself has decarbonised at about half the rate of the energy system. And all of that is due to technology spillovers that we've seen from the energy system coming into food. So it's more efficient cookers, it's better refrigerators, it's lorries that are lower carbon, it's all that kind of jazz. And if you look at the, sorry, let me get my little laser. If you look at the the blue bits here of agriculture, nothing has changed. And this is 2018 data, but it's actually true for 2022, the latest data available. We haven't decarbonized the land system at all since we passed the Climate Act. Nearly 15 years ago now. And that's kind of terrifying. And it's even more terrifying because we don't need the land system to be zero carbon. We need the land system to be negative carbon, because the logic of net zero requires something to do net. And unless DACS, direct air capture, carbon capture and storage, takes off in a big way, which feels unlikely from an energy perspective, we need land to be the sequesterer. This kind of decomposes it. This is data from the CCC. I won't dive into the details, but crudely put, if you were to kind of work all of this out, essentially society's choice is that we want frequent flyers and frequent burgers, and therefore we need the land system as the whole to be net negative to sequester the carbon that we're going to get out of ruminants and out of flying. It's a big ask for a sector that has done essentially nothing to decarbonize in the first 15 years. I want to speak briefly about the economics of the system, because I've talked about things aren't great from a carbon perspective, things are pretty awful from a nature perspective. Are they great from an economic perspective? Really complicated graphic, and again, I said I'd go quickly on the problem bit. The answer is yes, if you are a large cropping farm. You are in the money, and it's pretty good. Obviously, the weather's been absolutely awful this year, so there are a lot of farmers that are out of the money, but in aggregate, things are going okay. If you're any other type of farmer, possibly with some intensive pig, some dairy, basically you're losing money. So this is, and if you're a small farm, small, over there. Sorry, I had to change the size of things to get the axes to line up. I'm not a graphic designer. But they do line up. Don't worry, they're proportional. It's not misleading. You're doing terribly. 25% of farms in Britain make money from food production. The rest of them are either just barely breaking even or losing money. So it's not as if the system is producing good economic outcomes for the majority of farmers. Most of the money in the system is subsidy money, mostly that green bit there. And loads of farms are losing money in the negative axis, that light kind of blue out of the existing system. What if you care about food self-sufficiency? This has become a massive issue, both in the UK, but especially across the EU since the invasion of Ukraine for fairly obvious reasons. Well, the story that you will hear from the EU, which is true, is that the value of the food that is produced in Europe is greater than the value of the food that is imported. And that is true. Europe makes money. But if you measure it in land, the kind of fundamental unit, which I think makes sense for the food system, actually the UK is a massive net importer. What you can see is that the amount of land that we use to import food in Europe versus the land that we use to export food, there's a massive gap. About 16% of the EU28's land area effectively is overseas, which is used to feed us. So Britain is the outlier. We've got massive amounts of land overseas that we depend on. But even the EU, even with countries like France, which is an amazing agricultural producer, we are still not self-sufficient. So that's the problems bit over quite quickly. I guess you might be thinking, this guy's from California. I thought he did kind of sunny, hopey West Coast kind of, make me happy kind of stuff. Well, don't worry. I'm with you. We're going to get there. The food system is broken, though, and I think we've got to acknowledge that. And without a lot of change, we can't fix it. So where are my sources of hope? Again, very dorky slide, but you guys are academics, so you can handle this. This is a lovely bit of analysis, which just shows very different sorts of diets in the United States and in the UK down here. And the key point, and it took me a long time to explain this to policy wonks in government and elsewhere, is that if you compare the American production system up here, just look at adjusted baseline diet, which is what we actually eat if we ate enough food to not make us too fat, versus the adjusted baseline diet in the UK. There's a tiny difference. The axis on the bottom is greenhouse gas emissions. So American food production systems, much more efficient in kind of conventional terms. Americans doing a little bit more meat, but not that much more. The reality is that it doesn't look very likely that changing production systems are going to make the definitive difference on one of the important metrics for food system sustainability, greenhouse gas emissions. But we also have this, just eat plants things, where whichever country you're in, your choice of food is massively more influential. And like really big picture, 250 kilos versus 1750 kilos per person of CO2 per person per year, just through diet change. So we've got to be hopeful that we can do this because look, there are some people who are doing it. You don't have to be vegan, you be 2/3 vegan, you be low food chain, eat mussels, all that kind of stuff. I'm not telling you what you should eat, but the point is what you eat, but you guys know this, makes a vast difference, and that ought to create the sense that there is an opportunity here. It's not like we need some new space age exciting technology. And just to make the connection to nature, that's the same slide as I showed before. We will have plenty of land to do all the things that we want to if we adjust our diets. There's plenty of space to meet our nature goals. That's a bridge over to another reflection from me as an environmentalist. And I think if I am self-critical about the environment movement, we've done pretty well on climate. Not perfectly, but part of the reason why I moved from energy systems into land systems a couple of years ago is I looked at EVs. I looked at all this stuff and I thought, we're winning. The fundamental technology forces are there. I can see the direction of travel, loads of stuff to be done. We could still screw it up. But in general terms, we've kind of won the big argument. We've won the kind of big technical change and things are moving in the right direction. It's just not the case on nature. And it's not as if, from a civil society perspective, nature doesn't have huge public support, arguably more public support for nature than for climate-y stuff. Climate tends to be a bit kind of globalist, kind of lefty sort of things. Nature is very much across the political spectrum. And it's not necessarily for lack of money. I mean, Europe's largest conservation organization, the RSPB, I don't want to pick on them, they're a brilliant outfit. The reason why I say that is that it's not as if there hasn't been a lot of effort, a lot of human capital, a lot of money put into conservation, but it's not kind of doing it. And I sort of want to draw out why I think that's the case, or perhaps learn some lessons from where we've been successful in the energy system and then suggest how we might be successful on this most challenging issue of diet. So this is a little bit of a quick run through what the energy system transition felt like from somebody who was involved in making a case against coal and in favor of renewables, and actually also in favor of CCS, but that's a different talk if you want to pick up on it later. How many of you know about energy systems? How much knowledge can I assume in the room? So energy systems people, raise your hands. This is pretty good. Okay, that's pretty good. It's going to be a bit basic for you guys, but everyone else, stick with me. Do raise your hands if you don't understand. I'm going to start with the world as it was 15, 16, 17 years ago. This is RCP 8.5. Any of you who have looked at climate models will be familiar with it. It's the disaster scenario. And I remember looking at it 15 years ago and thinking, ooh, that seems quite bad. 4 degrees of warming, yikes. I don't think I kind of really processed what 4 degrees of warming would be like. Every time, I'm not a climate scientist. As you've heard my background, I'm basically a politics guy. Every time I look at climate science, it's more like looking into the abyss. And when I look at 4 degrees of warming, it's just like, it's civilization ending. And that was what the world looked like. And the big thing that was there is this coal wedge, because we thought it was inevitable. We thought coal is cheap. We've got a world full of people who need cheap energy for perfectly sensible, energy service reasons. I benefit from them. I wouldn't want to deny it from anyone else. And it looked pretty bleak because I couldn't imagine a world. This is part of the reason why I worked on CCS. I couldn't imagine a world where fossil fuels weren't going to do that. But my kind of pessimistic, realistic view was not the one that held sway in the NGO community. And we had lovely colleagues from, I think these are Greenpeace, protesting the new coal power station at Kingsnorth. This is Climate Camp back in 2008. We began to toxify the idea, or to raise the possibility that we could shut coal. And this was partially a moral crusade on the basis that we didn't want civilization to end. But also there was a bit of canny politics, which is not often talked about, where we in the NGO community said, what we want is renewables, what we want is clean energy, we want a mix of things. And what the gas industry was saying is, we quite like to kill coal because every unit of coal that isn't burned is an extra unit of gas that is burned. And I say that because we knew this was going on in environment land. We weren't naive. And we thought, I don't really want gas to be the winners of this transition because climate, but I'm not going to necessarily say that out loud because it is quite helpful when you raise questions about are renewables going to work, et cetera, for the bad guys or maybe less bad guys to have your back. And I draw this out just because when I think about food systems transformations, I wonder whether there might be something analogous. But I'm going to get onto analogies more clearly in a second. There was also a massive political moment. Some of you may have lived this political moment. Some of you may have heard it mythically in the past. This is David Cameron. He is not quite, oh no, he is hugging a husky. This is the actual huggy, oh Christ, you know what I mean. The point is, here was a new political leader on the right who had decided for his own narrow reasons that he needed to modernize his party and to use environmentalism as the means of modernizing it. And it was contingent. He did a very good job from an environmental perspective. I think it's fair to say I'm not too keen on many of his other policies, but I think whatever you think is deep in David Cameron's heart, there was a political moment and we ruthlessly exploited it as environmentalists. And I think that is the kind of political contingency that I want you to keep in your minds. And we boosted renewables, we did lots of dorky stuff. The world started to change. So this is 10 years ago, right? And what you're seeing, or what you should see, is that the coal line rather than going up in a wedge forever, is now flat. And there's this interesting little hint that maybe renewables might catch up. Now, they're definitely way below all the fossil fuels still, but something's changing. Something's getting interesting. But of course, it was not a straight story. I couldn't help but bring out my favorite lord, Matt Ridley, who wrote a brilliant piece in The Spectator saying that to the nearest whole number, the percentage of the world's energy that comes from wind turbines today is 0. This is 2015. And if wind power was going to work, it would have done so by now. At this point, I had spent 5 or 6 years, no, longer than that, 7 or 8 years going, wind turbines, they're kind of cool. They might work. They're actually quite interesting. They don't break. They're kind of cool. And but it was very much in contention. And this was a very technology-led sort of change. Well, we did some more work. This was our view, not Matt Ridley's view, of different costs in the system. So I should say I drew this diagram in a politically focused piece of analytical comms showing what we thought the world would look like back in 2015. So we knew that onshore wind was cheap. This was after the Conservative Party banned onshore wind because of the politics of onshore wind. We were like, why would you take off the table this lovely clean energy technology? Except it was quite controversial, and some people don't like it. But the basic story was we're going to get gas to get more expensive because we're going to load the costs of carbon onto gas. And eventually our saviors, PV, maybe nuclear, offshore wind, are going to come down in cost over time. And then we'll meet this lovely point at which, with carbon costs, gas will be more expensive than nuclear, PV, offshore wind. And that will all happen right about now, as we speak in this room. 2023, 2024, that kind of time, we thought. And if we could just keep the pressure down on bringing down the cost of renewables and keeping that escalating carbon price going, then that would solve the problem. Some of you may know what actually happened. I didn't draw this graphic very precisely, to be clear, but you will notice that my axis stops at 60 pounds per megawatt hour there. I remember in 2017 when the first offshore wind auction came through, we had a sweepstakes in the audience, in the office of like, how much would the cost of offshore wind? This is the kind of geekery we get up to at Great Alliance. And we were like, it's definitely going to be below 70, like absolutely, everyone was totally united on that. And we were like, maybe 60. I remember there was a particularly punchy colleague at the time who was like 58, I'm very confident. It came in at like 43 pounds per megawatt hour. We all just basically fell off our seats. We were just like, that's it. That's the whole ball game. We have effectively won the argument. We thought it was going to happen sometime. We had to maintain political support for a decade of hard slog with gas and renewables coming down in cost and all that. Well, it worked way better than we had hoped. Some of that is contingent, but some of that, I think, is about a story of how environmentalists harnessed technology and drove technology to the ends that we wanted, the carbon ends. And we did some slightly dirty deals with the gas industry on system security stuff, and we absolutely were ruthless in thinking about the politics of the moment, and some of that might be relevant to food systems. I just want to bring out efficiency as well. This is a lovely piece of analysis done by John Barrett and a few others, which looks at another part of the story which is not often told in the exciting, fun, renewables, wind turbines kind of story, and that is that for literally decades, the UK has been suppressing energy demand through a whole host of energy efficiency measures, and it's responsible, or was, up until I think 2013, that was when that data was done, it was responsible for 1/4 of UK economic growth. Long, slow, steady, very dorky. I did a lot of work on the Eco Design Directive, which I'll talk about more in a few minutes. And that was a really important part of the story because analytically, if you hadn't suppressed energy demand and you had grown renewables, you would have seen fossil fuels stay steady rather than declining as renewables shot up. And I think that is analogous in the system. Anyway, that's what happened. And the lovely glib story is economic growth up. This graph, you'll notice it stops in 2016. Economic growth up, decarbonization down. Well, the decarbonization has definitely continued. I'm not so sure about the economic growth, certainly not in real terms. But the point is we made a myth of success and we just kept repeating it. And that was incredibly important for that transition. So I'll draw out some of the analogies, then I'll draw out some of the bits that don't quite fit, and keen to get your take. So the first thing to say, I guess, is that whatever you think of renewables, and obviously I'm a fan, they were a massive disruptor of the energy system. So I picked on E.ON and RWE just because in the early part of last decade, they were really terrible. They did lots of lobbying in favor of fossil fuels, particularly RWE. They were really awful. And they took a massive bet and failed. Like, they lost tens of billions of euros worth of money. They eventually had to get bailed out by the German government because they didn't think that renewables were a thing. They were tech skeptics, they were entrenched in their interest, and they got punished very sharply by the markets. But it was the disruption that was really essential. And E.ON and RWE are still in the system today, but they had to go through this purgative effect of getting it wrong and reorienting. Peabody Coal, the world's largest coal miner, they went bust. And the interesting story, and the reason why I bring it out, sorry, I keep switching because it's on the wrong side for me, is what used to be Dong Energy and is now Ørsted. Dong was Danish oil and natural gas, and happily Danish and English line up with the acronym there. They, unlike RWE and E.ON, who had to get spanked by the markets, Dong were like, let's be a bit smarter than this. And so they switched and didn't take the downside. I guess the lesson here for me is that there's no route to revolutionary rates of change. And when you look at that vegan versus kind of omnivore thing, that feels revolutionary. When you look at the kind of land system change I briefly talked about, it's revolutionary, or at least radical, without disruption. And my hypothesis is that alternative proteins are the renewables of the food system. They can't do everything, but they could well be the disruptors that render a bunch of existing business models weak or painful. Or maybe we'll end up with, I don't know, JBS Meat doing a Dong to Ørsted kind of thing and becoming a pure play alternative proteins maker. Unlikely, but one can imagine. The other thing, and the reason why I put energy efficiency here is to make the point that stealth policy was amazingly effective. In fact, the Eco-Design Directive is so stealth a policy, I couldn't find a visualization for it, so I've actually used the EU energy label symbol there. But the point is, this is incredibly... Does anyone know about Eco-Design? Is this too in the weeds for you all? Eco-Design? Lovers of Eco-Design. Okay, I'm on my own. The Eco-Design Directive banned incandescent light bulbs 15 or so years ago. The Eco-Design Directive is why your vacuum cleaner, if you've bought one recently, now uses 800 watts rather than 2 kilowatts. It is essentially a very geeky policy that forces manufacturers to make products that use fewer resources and less energy. And in aggregate, it makes a huge deal. So analysis that we did with CMAP, an academic consortium several years ago, looked at the resource efficiency potential of eco-design across a whole bunch of different product groups and found it's as big as many of the things that you might also know about if you are an energy geek, like the renewable heat incentive. It's really big, but it flies entirely under the radar, or mostly did until the Brexit campaign when a bunch of sort of crazy MPs said we didn't want to bring back incandescent light bulbs. Happily, they did lose that argument. The point here, the lesson, is that regulation is essential to change, and you can and must counter manufacturers' narrow interests if you have a strong consumer benefit in mind. So at every eco-design forum I went to, the kind of consultation EU-level events, you'd always have the industry experts saying, it's impossible, we can't do this. And I remember I went along to some of these meetings, and I don't know what all these things technically are, but I could always rely on the argument that, look, as long as we're not driving up the price of the product at the point of purchase and we're saving energy, this is so clearly in consumers' interest that we must do it. And that argument eventually won the day. My hypothesis is that taxes on HFSS foods, high-fat, sugar, and salt foods, which will reduce the profitability of high-carbon junk food, can partly do this equivalent to efficiency long-run drive. And that's because people support regulation for health, and everyone kind of sees junk food as bad, and there is a reasonable overlap, not perfect, between high-carbon meat and dairy foods and junk foods. So I think there's a direct analogy for HFSS taxes, or some of the regulations, you might say, and something like eco-design, efficiency policy, stealth, boring, incredibly important. I've kind of said this already. We invested a lot of effort in David Cameron and in the Conservative Party in creating some political success. I guess what I want to draw out is the kind of lived reality of it. So we did some work with the Conservative administration then and offshore wind farm producers. Siemens in particular was interested in building a wind farm factory in Hull. and there are a few others nearby. This is David Cameron going to that wind farm factory opening. The politics of this was that David Cameron was facing UKIP, so this is pre-referendum. He was terrified about being politically weak on the long east coast of England, where UKIP was doing very well. And the story we said was, you need something totemic to show that you are on the side of normal working people on the east of England, and a big factory opening, we've got a nice ribbon where you can cut, is a really good way of showing that you are invested in the economic success of coastal England. And he bought it because basically no one else in the energy system could tell as good a story. And it was incredibly effective at driving his personal support and the rest of the cabinet's support in renewables at a time when renewables were still expensive when we're talking about here. So the lesson is that you need politically salient winners, or politicians won't sort of force change. I think that those winners are currently missing in the food system transformation. I think that agroecologists could be the winners in a food system transformation if they enter into quite a conscious alliance with alternative proteins, kind of techno-vegans. It's incredibly tricky, incredibly challenging, again, for the questions. I'm hearing some sighs over there of I've got questions or possibly disagreement. But without those winners, you don't drive politicians to take bold action. Final analogous thing for me, I guess, is that the UK's energy transition didn't look like a similar transition in Germany. Germany deliberately changed the ownership of the energy system through the Energiewende. What you see on this side over here is how there's a huge fraction of the renewables bit of the German energy system that is owned by individuals or groups of individuals. I mean, literally, it is a kind of own the means of production, quasi-Marxist political strategy that underlies this. The UK didn't do that, like not even close. I remember we tried to pitch an idea for a green ISO where you could put some money into an offshore wind farm because we realized no person was going to own an offshore wind farm, but we wanted to get people invested in the green success. Didn't go ahead. And I think in a sense, the UK had such, partially the reason for this is the UK had a conservative government that was not very interested in that model of kind of democratization of ownership. But also, Britain was very focused on cost, perhaps as befitting of a nation of shopkeepers. And so we chose not to address the question of who owns the energy system whilst also trying to decarbonize it. And I guess the lesson for me here is that your political change model has to fit the politics of the moment if you want to move quickly. The Energiewende started in 1980. Predates me, and really only gathered pace 30 years later when the technology kind of caught up. There was some ownership of grids locally, so it wasn't a nothing, but you know, the UK just didn't do that. Big energy won the UK's transition if you're viewing it in an ownership perspective. I mean, look who owns the UK's energy system. It's some of the big companies you recognize, some big investment companies. And that's to the chagrin of those who really wanted radical change and social change. I think for food, this should give us a sense of humility about how much change we want. We might not get everything, and big food might be a winner in a rapid diet change. Question mark is, are we happy with that? So I've got some thoughts on where we might not, and I'm going to run out of time, so I'm going to go a little bit quicker here. Sorry, Charles. The first thing to say is electrons are boring, food is culture, right? I love electrons. Some of you may love electrons, but really, who cares what's buzzing through the bloody light, you know? It's not material to people. And I guess the lesson here is that the soft stuff really matters. I did loads of analysis. I don't think the barriers of change were principally about, is the data quality good enough? There are lots of problems with data quality. I was talking to Harriet earlier about, like, where can we get this lovely data from? It's all hidden in retailers in this instance, or maybe, anyway. It's a problem, but we should be thinking about persuasion in the way that you would over a nice dinner conversation, primarily, and spreadsheets secondarily, although spreadsheets are really important. This is one of my favorite quotes from Stanley Baldwin, and I have found a suitably romantic painting to go with it. Aesthetics and rural culture in the UK are dominated by this idyll. It reinforces a mode of food production that's retained because it speaks to a national myth. You'll have heard from my accent, Charles introduced me as being a foreigner, which I am. I don't feel this in my bones, but I've lived here long enough. I used to work for CPRE, the Campaign to Protect Rural England, so I kind of lived it as a profession. This is incredibly powerful. It forms who many British people see as what they are. And the risk is that if there's a bit of, it creates a tighter than reality link between what we eat and what we imagine the nation to be. And so I guess if you're changing let me run it slightly differently. The reality is farming is only 0.3% of UK GDP. 75% of farmers don't make money from food. Economically, kind of rational lens, spreadsheet brain says, this is a sector that could be very easily transitioned. We're rich enough to just pay for it. What's the problem? But we're violently offending something deep and cultural. And I guess a vision of a different diet, therefore, needs to be told in paintings and in myth. And we almost certainly need to retain something of this painting in any discussion of what the good future looks like. That's why I think agroecology has to be part of the solution if we're to get diet change. Another disanalogy is that food's incredibly intimate. I kind of don't need to tell you all, but you literally put it in your mouth. Don't think about that too long because it's kind of weird. Solar panels are, kind of cool. Ed Miliband went up on that roof and had a nice photo call. That's Blackfriars Bridge in London. It transcends the rational food. And I kind of don't have a perfect answer on this one, but one answer is there's a brilliant essay from an alternative proteins kind of purveyor entitled "The Chicken You Eat Is Already Fake," and sort of brings out the selective breeding. And rational brain me is like, yeah, that makes sense. I'll go and eat a lab-grown steak. Irrational me is like, oh, I don't know, it's still a bit icky. I guess what I'd say is that maybe there's something in the slow normalization of flavor marketing, et cetera. I just point out, a plastic bottle of Diet Coke is wholly unnatural, and yet we consume it all the time and think of it as lovely. Not least because it's associated with what I would call Santa Claus and you might call Father Christmas. Brilliant marketing. Final disanalogy is, we toyed in the food strategy with the idea of this thing called the energy trilemma. Does anyone know what the energy trilemma is? Yep, okay. So energy trilemma is this idea that you kind of have to choose somewhere in the middle of either you can have cheap, or you can have green, or you can have secure energy. And you choose where you want to be, but you cannot have all three things at once. Like that was the core of the logic of it. And when we were talking about diet, it could be healthy, sustainable, and convenient. Choose where you want to be on those, or maybe we had a quadrilemma. You'll love this. Healthy, sustainable, cheap, and convenient. Where do you want to be? There's a hard trade-off there. Well, the reality of the energy system is we made the trilemma obsolete because renewables became so cheap that it would be idiotic to do anything other than the green choice. And when you talk about security, yes, renewables are intermittent, but it's very difficult for Putin to turn off the taps of wind in the North Sea. And that has proved to be a very persuasive argument in favor of energy security. The thing about food is that, and I've just referenced the junk food cycle from the National Food Strategy here, there isn't a similar kind of technology force that is eliding the dilemma, trilemma, quadrilemma. You work out how many lemmas there are. And this, to me, says we really do need a very direct intervention in diet. It probably needs to be a state intervention because we're not going to get around it purely with the kind of white heat of technology. How much longer do I have? 5 minutes. Okay, we're going to go really fast then. 5 minutes. This is our version of what disruption could look like, trying to learn the lessons, a bit of modeling that Lydia Collis and I have done, draws on alternative proteins. These are the basics, various different types of alternative proteins. You guys are a clever, well-knowledgeable audience, so I'm not going to look at the differences. The point is they all use way less land than conventional meat and dairy. And if you make some assumptions about how diets might change, and I'm very happy to talk about the assumptions that we've made and how we've derived them semi kind of plausibly, we've come up with a kind of lower intervention diet where plant-based foods, essentially the hypothesis is that technology kind of stops where it is now in the alternative protein space. So the plant-based guys get a bit tastier and a bit more interesting, and precision fermentation does a bit more. So Impossible Burger, for example, if you've been to the United States, has a precision fermentation ingredient in it, but we don't assume any serious disruption. We don't assume that the casein and the whey guys managed to make milk obsolete. In the high innovation scenario, we do assume that, and we also assume that cultivated meat becomes price competitive with at least some types of food. If you pull that into your diet, and you can see the amount of change in your diet on the percentage axis there, what you find is an absolutely extraordinary land dividend is created. So what we did was to look at 10 European countries, which represent 70% of land area and 80% of GDP across the UK and the EU, and we found that in that high innovation scenario, if you make this dietary change assumption that alternative proteins will supplant conventional meat and dairy by 2050, you get a France worth of freed up land that we just don't need to produce food, and a Spanish equivalent area of land overseas. It's extraordinary. It's the first time since the founding of the New World by Europeans anyway, that we've had loads of land to play with. And that is potentially very exciting. Maybe that possibly gets into the myth, the kind of hope space. But we didn't just say, well, how much is land is freed up? We also thought, how might we spend that land dividend? We have in mind here a kind of 3-compartment model, which is more land system stuff, happy to talk about later. But very crudely, for every 3 units of land that are freed up, we use 1 for onshoring, 1 for semi-natural habitat creation, and 1 for agroecology, just because we know European policymakers have set these out as things that they wanted, and so we thought we'll just spend them in that way. This is not optimized. We haven't said this is the best way of doing it. If you do that, what you see here is land use across all of the countries that we studied. Apologies for the very complicated slide. This is today. Poland and France and Romania are net exporters of food, but most of us are net importers. And in that high innovation scenario, what you see is that Europe as a whole becomes a net exporter of food in land systems terms, and only the Netherlands and the UK remain net importers. It would be an extraordinary change driven only by dietary shifts. Because we care about climate change, the model is climate constrained. We force the system to get to net zero. We make assumptions about the energy system which are grounded in policy commitments that other European countries have made. Obviously, the net bit you could either do with BECCS or with natural habitat. And what we find is that in the high innovation scenario, you don't need very much BECCS because most of your land system, because we've created some semi-natural habitat, is able to sequester carbon, and that's really valuable. We spend $3 billion a year on BECCS across these countries versus 24 billion in the low innovation scenario. So it's very cost effective. It's very good value for money. We know the EU has a target for area of land under organic production of 25%. And in the high scenario, which is the pink, the bars stack on top of each other, every country other than the Netherlands and Poland just about gets there, but not quite, is able to farm 1/4 of its land organically, and critically it does so without any offshoring, because what we don't want is to farm organically in the UK and cause places across the world to deforest as a result. And then the final one is that there is plenty of room for nature. So the brown bars are the minimum amount of land you would need to meet the Annex 1 species. I'm not a conservation biologist. This is where the Dioculus has provided all of the heavy lifting. But there's plenty of land for all of the species that are in that Annex 1 set of countries if you want to restore nature. So, in summary, I think we need a technology disruption in order to create the political space for dietary change. I also think alongside that we need a lot of regulation. So for me, it's alternative proteins plus something like an HFSS tax, something health-focused, but with environmental co-benefits. For me, the lesson of the energy transition is that we need to be radicals, but maybe not revolutionaries. So thinking about the German Energiewende example, how much of a system change do we want versus how much radical change? Tricky, difficult, I don't have the answer, but it's something we should consider. And then the final thing is that we desperately lack political winners in diet change. Speaking to politicians, diet change is all privation, all loss. And until we can create a sense of political winners, I think most politicians won't want to touch it. Thank you all very much.
Dustin, thank you. That was typically thought-provoking and absolutely brilliant. I'm going to abuse my position by asking the first question, and it is about alternative proteins. And you talked about the lack of winners. Well, if there was an alternative protein industry, then there are potential winners there. But we are in a position where Giorgia Meloni in Italy, for example, is threatening to ban alternative proteins. I think there are similar moves in Dublin. What is the narrative that is going to allow alternative proteins to change at scale to provide the benefits that you've talked about in those last few slides?
I'll take a stab at it. I think the narrative which I find most persuasive is that you need to think about the world, not just your country. Now, that's perhaps not a native way of thinking for somebody like Giorgia Meloni. Alternative proteins are likely to happen. They're happening in China because the Chinese are facing a massive land crunch, and that's before climate begins to disrupt their food system. It's happening in the Middle East because the people in the Middle East have quite a lot of money. They know that it's probably not politically effective for them to land grab in Africa to feed themselves, and the prospect of alternative proteins is a pure food security thing. And there's enough fizzy pop kind of bubble money in California and other parts of the United States to provide plenty of VC funding for quite a lot of this stuff to happen there too, and a regulatory regime that is quite happy to make it happen. So the question for Europeans is not, will alternative proteins happen? The question for Europeans is, do you want a stake in the economic upside of alternative proteins, and do you want to control the industry? Because if you let Americans, people in the Middle East, Chinese, etc., develop it, you will have no say over the development of the industry. And as an American who has made his life in Europe, I would quite like Europe to have some say in that industry.
Splendid. Questions for Dustin? At the back.
Can you hear me? Am I loud enough?
Yes.
I want to push back on the parallel you make between atoms and food, because I think it's something I've heard before, and actually heat and warmth are very cultural. They're very important to us culture. They go back to our oldest narratives about ourselves. So maybe we're thinking about food in the wrong way. We're thinking too far down to the end product, rather than thinking about atoms are part of the production system. So we've got too focused on the very end product. We need to be thinking further up the food system.
I guess, yeah, let's think about heat pumps, for example, which is the obvious successor to gas boilers. The pitch isn't live in a cold house. The pitch is let this interesting machine somewhere over there kind of deal with it for you. Maybe the analogy to the food system is that nearly half the meat that we eat is in processed or pre-prepared foods, and we may not be that bothered about whether the lamb in the supermarket moussaka is actually from a sheep or just tastes like it's from a sheep. Or maybe we'll just mix in some lentils and have half lentil, half lamb. So perhaps there's more space for change there than I accounted for.
Thank you. Roberto.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your presentation. Super interesting. I understand your optimism, like coming from alternative proteins. I would like to cast just some doubt, but not because I'm Italian. I don't like the German. So, no. And but I wanted to ask you, like, one of the problems is the potential problems is that it's not certain that these alternative proteins are just gonna substitute animal food. That's the problem. Like, so I'm afraid sometimes when I think about this win-win considerations, or I don't know, narrative, if you want. At the end of the day, there are gonna be some losers. I mean, there is gonna be someone who's gonna produce less of something at the end of the day. And so I'm thinking like how to move towards like a future in which we have more alternative proteins and less animal food also. Because if you come also to the energy, let's say, case, analogy, another problem that I see in that sector is that at the global level, over the last 10 years, it's true that we have exponentially increased renewables, but we still have more coal than 10 years ago, if we consider also the least developed countries, etc. Because still, indeed, like, this economic loss is not accepted sometimes. So how to make those strata which are going to be affected by some economic loss accepting this? I don't know. Like, I don't even know how to frame the question, but maybe you understood more or less.
I did, and thank you. I guess the direct analogy for me is to compare the UK and Germany's decarbonisation trajectory. The UK pursued a very explicit get-out-of-coal policy whilst also adding renewables. Germany pursued build as much renewables as possible. And Germany has much more renewables than the UK, but was very soft on coal. And what we saw was that coal has persisted on the system for much longer, and the emissions are much higher in Germany. So the analogy, I guess, to the food system is, I think, factory farming. Now, analytically, factory farming can be very efficient and sometimes can be high welfare. So one has to be a bit careful in the detail. But at the level of rhetoric, saying, is it so bad that the sort of farming that most people in Britain and in Europe find a bit unpleasant loses out, so long as some of the type of farming that are culturally attractive are retained? Maybe that's a transition that can make sense. But you do need to suppress some part of the farming sector. Otherwise, you're right, we might just have a carnivore or pseudo-carnivore lifestyle. I don't know.
Thank you. Question there.
My question is perhaps like the other half of
A bit louder.
Sorry, my question perhaps is like a second half of this question, which so you described alternative proteins as a potential disruptor, but maybe not a political winner at the moment. But then you said that agroecology is looking like a political winner. Do you think that can function like a disruptor, or is it just too small scale? Or, you know, can lower inputs, can that function as a disruptor to a market as well?
So to answer the question straight, I don't think that agroecology can act as a disruptor in that kind of technology disruptor type of model. And that's because it is principally an ethical disruptor. So it says, consider what values are in the food system and what you actually want to transact for. So the most persuasive agroecological argument, I think, is what you buy determines the food system you get. And if you buy kind of cheap crap that creates bad environmental and sort of health and nature and socioeconomic outcomes, you should change what you do. I guess that whatever you want to be true, if you look at the evidence, people are not buying a lot of agroecological food. If you take organic as a proxy, the share of organic has been flat stroke gently declining for 15 years. So that's why I think that essentially the disruption has to come from something that is semi-flavor equivalent, or at least close enough, and cheaper.
And our last question, I'm afraid, from the front.
Yeah, so again, thank you for the talk.
Sorry, a bit louder as well.
Okay, so I'm curious on the cultural side of, okay, maybe there's a difference here comparing like the renewable transition to the food transition. I'm wondering, like a potential concern I have or a caveat is, so this like concept of like gastro-nationalism where, you know, food is almost weaponized for like political agendas, and you see this on the right time and time again, especially in Italy, in France, and Spain. And I'm wondering though too, like, even if we kind of focus on, okay, but it's factory farms, like they're the problem, and we kind of try to create this sort of frame alignment where it's like, you know, trying to push the agroecology agenda and maybe even alternative proteins. I'm wondering if there's certain food products though where people just maybe don't care, but it's protecting like the end product. Like, I mean, kind of think of something like foie gras. I guess that doesn't really have that much of a maybe a sustainability impact. I mean, it's ducks, but so maybe that's a poor example. But when it comes to addressing that, like, I mean, would you have any concerns of whether people really care about the origins, but the product itself and protecting the farmers, or is it the producers? Because I'm wondering if maybe if that argument would really work, like if people are identifying with the cuisine, the end goal, like how much do we know that the origins really matter? And
so I guess this is why I talked a bit about myth, because analytically, the relationship between what we grow and what we eat is quite loose, particularly in a country like the UK, but even in a country with a pretty localist, rich food culture like Italy. I guess a couple of things that make me optimistic. Even in our super high scenario that I showed you, 30% of meat is still from an animal, and I would expect that to be the kind of culturally valuable stuff. So it'll be the Charolais beef from, you know, that region of France. It might be the prosciutto crudo, because that's probably culturally quite important. I don't know, we've got an Italian in the audience, so he can correct me if I've got it wrong. There is space for that in a system transition. I guess the other thing I'd say is, you know, despite France's amazing food culture, there's quite a lot of McDonald's in France. Mm-hmm. And when we look at how people's diets are actually changing, whatever the intent, and my argument would be this is the power of the global food system, the United States is kind of at the high bar of high ultra-processed food, high processed, high fast food, all that kind of stuff, 60, 70% of the diet. In Britain's about halfway between the continent and the United States in terms of that share of food in the diet. But every country that I've looked at, the percentage is rising over time. So whatever you believe about how food culture ought to be, what's actually happening is we're eating more processed, pre-prepared kind of food. So that's a space for the kind of sciencey substitution to potentially operate.
Look, I know there are lots more questions, but Dustin will be outside during the poster session, so please approach him there. Just before thanking Dustin again, a couple of thank yous. First of all, the conference has been organised by a group, Micah, Lisa, Hannah, Emma, Harriet, Rue and Elif, and many thanks for all your hard work. But thanks especially to Lexi. But thanks especially to Lexi. I'm determined to thoroughly embarrass Lexi. Come forward there.